Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. Today, we talk about the Philippines from 1800 to 1930 and the transition from one empire to another. So, when we left, the Philippines were starting to be colonized by Spain, or at least the northern Philippines were. Philippines is several thousand islands, and the Spanish used the city of Manila as a center for trade. The Philippines was Spain's connection to Chinese trade. If you remember, the whole point of Columbus was to get to China. And what he did was run into the Americas. Well, that didn't mean that Spain stopped wanting to get to the Americas. What they did was create a Mexico to China route. So it's Spain to Mexico, Mexico to China. Well, you need a place to stop because, it's 6, 7, 8,000 miles, depending on how you chart it, between Mexico and China. And so the Philippines turned out to be the place that Spain would use. They got there first. Ferdinand Magellan got there and was murdered there, was killed there for getting involved in tribal warfare. And what in subsequent years, as we discussed, the Spaniards realized they could do something with the Philippines. But it's not very deep. Their control over the Philippines is as a way stop. It's kind of, in some ways, the Portuguese control over East Timor. It's a place that you have a town in order to get to other places. And so you have the Spanish in the north. They have various allies with local chiefs, local tribes, local kings, depending on what their elevation is. And then in the south, where the Philippines comes nearest to Indonesia, you have Islamic kingdoms. Converted tribes. You have Islam. And the reason why is very simple. Those are the ones who are trading with the Muslim merchants in Indonesia. And so, to make all of that easier, they became Muslim. And so, as, hundreds of years went on, you get this divide. Whereas the center and the north, farther away from Indonesia, remained native religions, polytheism religions. The south was Islamic. Now, with the coming of the Catholic Spanish, you're going to start to get Christianity, and that's going to start in the north. And so, we talked a little bit about China, and we'll do this again and again. The thing that actually leads to the Opium War, for example, is that China doesn't need anything from Europe. The Europeans show up and say, buy our stuff. And the Chinese are like, dude, we have all of this. We don't need anything. In fact, the entire history of Chinese trade was the selling of Chinese luxuries, especially silk, but also spices, paper, technology like gunpowder, west to the Europeans. The Europeans were at the end of the Silk Road. It went to Central Asia, then to the Islamic states of the Middle East, and then to the Christian states in Europe. It didn't really flow the other way. Mexico is Spain, the Philippines, Mexico is the one exception. The one exception that China will want is Spanish-Mexican silver. That they want. Because that was the basis of money. And so for all the people, the French and the British and the Germans who show up and say, buy our stuff, and the Chinese are like, no. When the Spanish show up and have, we've got silver, the Chinese basically say, come on in. Let's talk. What would you like to buy? Because Chinese economics was based on the silver trade, was based on silver coinage. And so it was the only Western trade China actually wanted. Which, let's face it, is kind of funny because everybody had been wanting to get to China to buy and sell stuff. And Christopher Columbus' entire point was to get to China. And all of the horrors that are going to happen in the New World are going to happen because America is in the way. And it turns out that Columbus was right. He was the one guy who could have showed up in China and the Chinese would have liked to have bought and sold with. Not the Portuguese, not the British, not the Dutch, not the French. Turns out it would have been the Spanish, but only if they had Mexico. So if there had been no Americas, it still wouldn't have worked. They needed to have the silver. So in 1648, as part of the 80 Years' War that's going on in the Catholic Protestant wars in Europe, the Dutch attack the Philippines, but can't take it over. This is part of the Dutch anti-Portuguese, right? During the 1600s and 1700s, the Dutch replaced the Portuguese in most of East Asia. There's only a few places they don't. Like they take over Indonesia, but they never go after East Timor. It's too far away and it's too poor. It's not really worth it. South Africa, for example, and they replaced the Portuguese. Well, the Portuguese and Spain were actually united for a while in the early 1600s, actually until about 1640. This is in 1648 is the end of the 30 Years' War, and the Dutch attack the Philippines but can't take it over. In the 1760s, the English try to do it again. The English try to take it over. As the English show up in the Indian Ocean, they're taking over India. They're replacing the Dutch, basically. So it's the Portuguese first, then the Dutch, and then the English. And what they do is basically take over the places like New York, right? The Dutch show up, the Dutch start a colony, and then the British come in and say, this is ours now. And boom, they now own it. The English actually do take over Manila, but give it back in a peace treaty. And the thing that really matters is whether or not you can keep it is Filipino support, local, tribal, local kingdom support. Which means if you're the Spanish, you can't go around shooting Filipinos. You have to actually be nice to them. So the Spanish existence in the Philippines is going to be different than a lot of other colonial imperialist relationships. It's going to be different than the American one at the end of the 19th century because there's not a lot of Spaniards. There's a country of 1 million, 2 million, 3 million people, maybe more. I don't know what the population is in 1750. It's probably much more than a few million. There's not that many Spaniards. And the Spanish Empire is weak. And so they need Filipino support to maintain it. And so what happens is Catholicism spreads as Spain kind of develops, kind of stays longer. It's clear that money and education plus better jobs are all tied to Catholicism. If you're a Catholic Filipino, you could get in on the European jobs and European trade with China easier than if you're not. And so just like the Muslims in southern Philippines, Filipinos in the northern Philippines begin to convert. Spanish want them to convert. They, in a lot of ways need them to convert. And so there's a conversion. And what that does is once you're Catholic, you kind of get into the club. Now, remember, there's always racism. So the Filipinos are never going to be treated as equal. But at the same time, they're necessary to Spanish success in the Philippines. And so now you get government jobs, bureaucratic jobs, mercantile jobs, business jobs, education. The Catholic priests are going to start opening up schools, and Filipinos can go to that. Now, what are the point of those schools? They are, like British schools in India, to basically train not a leadership group, but a middle class that will work for the Spanish. Now, that's middle class, your managerial class, the people you need to run the show, and the people who can step up if the leadership, i.e. the Spanish, are ever kicked out or go home. So, in some ways, we're seeing exactly what colonialism was supposed to be, which is ironic given how terrible the Spanish treat the Americas, the Native Americans. In the South, you get Islam, and it starts to decline as trade with Indonesia declines. Now, why would trade with Indonesia decline? Because the Spanish care about the Chinese trade. And Indonesia isn't owned by Portugal anymore. It's owned by the Dutch. And the Dutch and the Spanish are at war throughout most of the 1600s, 1700s. And so there's not a lot of... So what you can see is the Europeans are breaking up traditional trade routes and redirecting them to themselves. The Filipino trade routes are now going from China to the Philippines, Philippines to Mexico, Mexico to Spain. And there's less local trade in the Pacific Ocean. The Filipinos to Indonesia or Northern Australia, Japan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia. You're getting less of that as Spain begins to reorientate where trade is going. Now, there's no don't trade with, but since the Spanish have the money, and the most money you can make is doing Spanish trade, what the Spanish want, being part of the Spanish trade routes, what it does is sucks talent. People go, well, maybe I won't go to Indonesia now. All right, I can't sell what I'm going to buy to the Spanish, so why do it? Why not get involved in the Chinese trade? But since Indonesia and the Philippines, southern Philippines, are literally geographically close, they remained Muslim with local kind of necessary trade connections. But northern Philippines gets richer, southern Philippines gets poorer, and thus is the opposite of basically the last 1,000 years. In 1815, you have the last Philippines to New Spain galleon, the last Philippines to Mexico galleon, because you're starting to get the revolutions in Mexico, Central America, South America against Spain, following the Napoleonic Wars. And so you get the end of that Pacific trade route. Now notice 1815 is real close to the beginning of the Opium Wars, when the Chinese were like, no, everybody stay out. We don't want any of your trade. We don't want you. Right? The Opium trade wars with Britain are going to happen in the 1830s. And so what you get is an acceleration of China trying to close off the rest of the world. Without Spanish silver, why deal with the rest of these Europeans, right? You now have the close of the only trans-Pacific trade route at the time, Philippines to Mexico. And now Spain has less colonial wealth, less trade. And so you can imagine the Spanish Empire also declines. The irony of this is this makes Spain care more about the Philippines. Why? Because they've lost all their other colonies to revolution. And so to have any trade, Spain is no longer the preeminent power in Europe. It's clearly England now. You had the French. Spain was up to, 1660, 1700. Louis XIV, it was replaced by the French. And from 1700, and we can always debate about it, whether it's earlier, it really is earlier, but just to be round in the numbers, 1700 to 1800, it's France dominating European politics. And after that, for the next century, it's going to be England, following the Napoleonic Wars. So if you're Spain in an era where everyone's gobbling up colonies, what do? Well, you say, hey, I already got the Philippines. It's already mine. So now what you have to do is make sure nobody takes it. It gives you an access to Japanese or Chinese trade or even Korean trade if it ever opens up, right? It puts you on the trade routes. You could always have Filipino pirates attacking, British, French, if trade merchants, if you ever need to. But what you get is actually Spain starting to care now that the New World is gone, which was way wealthier, way more important on a daily basis. Now it's like, well, we got one place left. The Philippines. So what happens? Now that they start to care, the economy starts to change. It's now Manila and the Philippines is no longer a way station. It's now going to have to be a colony that makes money. And so what happens is land use changes from small farmers, peasant farmers, traditional land agriculture to plantation agriculture, to cash crops, to stuff that can be sold on the world market, sugar, tobacco, and especially coffee. The Philippines will become the largest Asian producer of coffee. Sugar from the New World will be planted in the Philippines. And tobacco as well will be planted. And so instead of being a mercantile class, you're now getting a plantation agricultural ownership class. And within 20 years, so this change is going on, and as soon as you moved from a middleman, everything is about the China to Mexico trade. Now that we're actually going to make stuff for the world market, in comes Britain. The export trade to Britain is going to replace Spain as the largest market, which makes sense. Britain is the largest economy in the world in 1830, and so it has access to more world markets. It has access to more buyers, more sellers. And so if you want to make money, if you're a plantation owner in Mindanao, what do? You sell it on the British market. So the British don't need to take over Spain. Not Spain. They don't need to take over the Philippines because they essentially begin to dominate it economically. The Spanish crown will get a cut. Of course, the Spanish plantation owners will make their profits, of course, and the British make the money as the carrying trade, as the middleman. Why own the Philippines? It's just an expense. Let Spain deal with that. You're making all the profits. So you have access to the markets. You have an open trade network. Spain, who in 1830 is poor, they need the tariffs and the taxes. And so you have this symbiotic relationship. Everyone's making out something. Except the Filipino peasant. Because they went from subsistence agriculture. They went from owning their own land, maybe 20 acres or so, maybe less, to now working for a white dude or a rich Filipino. So you can understand your independence suffers. You're not a slave. You're not a serf. But you're not independent either. You don't own your own land anymore. You're a wage worker for someone else who's building a big house. and who tells you what to do, and who is always going to work you harder, because the harder you work, the more money they make. You don't make more money. They make more money. So you could see this is going to cause a problem. So what happens? Well, by the 1880s, you have a substantial expatriate community of Filipinos in Europe. They speak Spanish, French, or English, and they're getting a European education. And with that European education comes the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of freedom, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. And then in 1848, there's the revolutions all over, the democratic revolutions all over Europe. And they see that. And they go, hey, if they're doing that, why can't we do that? And remember, you have the same revolutions going on half a century earlier in the United States, Mexico, South America. And so remember, that was the trade route. And so those people are coming back, sailors are coming back going, hey, they're talking about freedom and equality. And then the Filipinos look around and go, we don't have freedom and we don't have equality. The Spanish keep telling us what to do. And so what you get by the 1880s is this ferment. People are meeting, they're getting the education, they're talking, they're writing. They've seen the revolutions of 1848, and by the 1880s you have enough expatriates that you get a community. By 1892, you now have a party. You have organization. Organize. The formation of the Independence Party, the Katipunan, led by Andres Bonifacio. Now, notice, he's Filipino. He's got a Spanish name. Andres Bonifacio. And their basic idea is Spain clearly sucks. They came to Europe from the Philippines. Now, in the Philippines, the white men, they're impressive. They're rich. They have big ships. They have cannon and whatnot. They're pretty impressive. But then you see the British, and you see the French, and you go to Paris, and you realize Spain ain't all that. This is the same kind of disaffection that happens with the Portuguese Empire, and later with the Dutch Empire. It's like, yeah, they're nice, but they're better in Asia. They seem more powerful than when you go to Europe, and you go, yeah, you know. But if you go to London, Paris, New York, you clearly know Spain sucks. So if Spain sucks, why are they telling you what to do? Why are you being oppressed by Spain? They suck. It'd be one thing being oppressed by the British. They're powerful. It's another thing to be oppressed by a second-rate country. And so Spain's decline feeds into this independence movement, and that is very important. You don't need, in a lot of cases, the groups that have been going on for this century of we'll work with them. We'll grow up, like will happen in British India. Like after 1856 and the Sepoy Mutiny, there's plenty of people who don't like the British, but they also know the British will come in and shoot us. So what do? Well, we'll work for the British, and eventually the British will leave. Right? I might as well make out. I'll get a good job. I'll get the education. I'll give what the British are selling, and I'll put up with them for now. But I'll learn the skills, and then my kids will learn the skills, and we'll all make money, and eventually there'll be enough of us we can kick them out. In the Philippines, you can bypass that because Spain ain't that powerful. And so in 1896, notice only a few years after the formation of the Independence Party, the Philippines revolution breaks out. And it's kind of accidental. It wasn't intended. It was, they were meeting, they were doing the things that one does all over Europe in the 1900s. You have your parties, you have your secret meetings, you got, and Spain has their spies, and you're all playing the game, right? And what happens is, the Independence Party is discovered. Their secrecy is discovered. And there's fear of arrests, that Spain will start arresting, mass arrests of anyone who was involved in it. And they basically went, well, it's now or never. And so you get the outbreak of revolt. The outbreak of revolt in one place equaled the revolution in other places, in 8 other provinces, and that's why you get a flag with the 8 rays of light. You know, it starts like we have the 13 stars, they have the 8 rays of light, and you have a revolution. And Ernesto Aguinaldo becomes the leader of the rebel groups, and he's elected the first president of the new republic. But what's also happening, as happens in most revolutions, it spins out of control. It becomes more liberal. You have a fracturing of unity, especially once you're successful. The educated classes who are tied to Spain refuse to join, and that's incredibly important. In the United States, that's the class that leads the revolution. When you look at the Declaration of Independence, there are 55 names or so. All of those guys are rich. All those guys are the educated class in the United States. None of them are poor. And so they're going to be the ones who take over, which is why they're called the Founding Fathers. In Spain, in the Philippines, you don't get that because they're tied to Spanish wealth, Spanish trade, Spanish plantations. You know, if you're the peasants revolting, the thing you want to do is break up those plantations. Well, if you're one of those Filipino plantation owners, you're like, all right, maybe we'll break up the Spanish plantations, but, you know, I'm Filipino. You don't mean me. And it's unclear whether they do. They kind of do. You know, or the idea is once Spain's gone, there's nothing stopping them from coming after you as well. And so it spins out of control. Bonifacio, who was the original leader of the party, is executed. The educated classes refuse to join, so the revolution fractures. Spanish reinforcements show up in the ports. And so you have this grind until 1898, when the Americans arrive. Because in 1898, while the Spanish are fighting to put down the Filipino Revolution and kind of winning, remember, the more Filipino support you have, the more likely you are to win. If the middle classes, if the educated classes, if the leadership Filipino classes, the ones with money, are on your side, most revolutions will fail. Unless you murder all those people. See the French Revolution. And then an accident in Cuba ignites the U.S.-Spanish War, the Spanish American War. And what happens is the American Pacific Fleet, the one that has been harassing or working with, depending on what time period it is, Japan, and basically getting rid of pirates and kind of making sure American whalers and American trade is unmolested by all these other European countries, descends on the Philippines, descends on Manila. The U.S. Pacific Squadron comes in, blows stuff up, sinks the Spanish fleet, takes over Manila, and it's clear Spain's finished as a colonial power. Spain's just done. There's a new tough guy on the block. There's a new dog in the pound. American ships are bigger, they're heavier, they're much more technologically advanced. They are industrial. They are an industrial fleet. Now, the United States is still a small army. It's still a small power compared to Britain or France or Germany. But it's clearly better than Spain. And remember, the Philippines wasn't important in the Spanish-American War. The real fighting is going on in Puerto Rico and Cuba. And what the Americans do is transport Aguinaldo from exile. They bring him back to Philippines, just like the Germans will do with Lenin. And the idea is, hey, Aguinaldo has respect. The Americans don't really want to run the Philippines, but they'll use it. They'll make money off of it. There's no Americans living there. And so, hey, we'll make an ally, right? The way Korea is to China was, in theory, the way it was supposed to be of the Philippines with the United States, right? The U.S. will be a protectorate, but the Filipinos will run their own country, and Aguinaldo is clearly the leading person, right? Without Bonifacio, it's going to be Aguinaldo. The U.S. even bought the Philippines. They paid Spain. They won the war and then said, look, we got Cuba. We're taking Puerto Rico from you. Here, we'll buy. Just so there's no hard feelings, we'll buy the Philippines from you. Which is kind of crazy, but it's the way you could see. The United States, even in 1898, doesn't really want an empire. It's not thinking in imperial terms. It wants trade to Asia. It wants security, sure. It needs a way station for its merchants from Hawaii, from the West Coast, from San Francisco to Hawaii. Hawaii to where? In theory, it was going to be Japan, but as Japan industrializes, that's going to not be the case. So the Philippines is a good second place. From the Philippines, you can go to Japan if you need to Southeast Asia, and especially to China. So, okay, it works out. So the U.S. buys it. No hard feelings. Spain is done. So the U.S. now owns, technically, quote unquote, owns the Philippines, but has no desire to run it. Has no experience running Asian imperial colonies. So here we go. All right. So Aguinaldo, here's the problem. Revolutionaries want to create a free country versus the country that doesn't really want to own it, but wants to stay. Now, you would think you can negotiate that, but always remember there's racism involved. The Filipinos are Filipino, meaning East Asian, and they're Catholic, which is another strike against them. Because remember, Americans are predominantly Protestant, descended from German, British stock, and white, and European. So they come in with the idea of, you're not really ready to run your own country. Even though Americans don't really want to run the Philippines. Remember, there's always there's an old saying about America that it's not that old, but it's a 20th century saying. The United States will always do the right thing after it has exhausted all other options. And that's essentially the American experience in the Philippines. It didn't have to be bad, and it turned out to be bad. So what you end up with is a Filipino American War. The Filipinos were not going to just switch. They looked at it and went, wait a minute, we got rid of the Spanish, and now we have to deal with the Americans, and the Americans are going to act like the Spanish? No. And the Americans are like, dude, we're not really the Spanish. We don't really want to run the place, but you should do what we tell you because, you're Filipino, and you suck. And the Filipinos are like, dude, we don't suck, and this is our country. And so from 1899 to 1902, you have the Filipino American War. And this is actually one of the topics I was going to when I originally started graduate school. This was a forgotten war. When I originally started graduate school, I thought, this is the war I could do. Before I got into Sweden, which itself was from undergrad, but before I really decided on that, I thought, I can do this. There wasn't really any books on it yet. It was really a forgotten war. And it's kind of the Vietnam before Vietnam in a lot of ways. And it's very racist. We're going to see this when we go to World War II. It's a very racist war. American mercenaries, American troops are going to cut the ears off of people, cut the heads off of people. There's lots of atrocities. Basically, the Americans took the racism and the violence of the Indian Wars and brought it to the Philippines. And the Indian Wars had just finished. But you're talking genocidal type of conflict, a mindset, a crusader type of conflict, crusader kind of mindset, and bringing it to colonialism. So for people who didn't really want to run the Philippines, the army shows up intent on crushing the Philippines. This becomes the first modern guerrilla war. The first war where it looks like Malaysia, it looks like Kenya, it looks like Algeria, it looks like Vietnam, fighting in the jungles, no major battles. For Filipino forces can't match U.S. firepower, and so what they do is lure U.S. troops into traps, go after U.S. allies. The Americans build concentration camps, which they learned from the British in the Boer War, which is going on like literally at the same time. So the British are like, hey, we just built a concentration camp and we put all the people in it. This would lead to some 200,000 Filipinos dying of famine and disease. So concentration camps are bad from the moment they're created. Whether the U.S. does them, whether the British do them, whether the Germans will do them, whether the Japanese will do them, whether the Chinese will do them much later on, whether the United States does them with immigrants in the 2016 to 2020. Concentration camps are always bad. The modern prison system works like this. They're always bad. People die. People live inhumanely. People get sick. People are crowded together. They never have enough food. They never have enough health. It's always bad. The result of this war is that the United States starts to run the Philippines. It starts installing naval bases to patrol the Pacific, Japan, China, and to connect trade to Hawaii. All those sugar plantations, thank you. Tobacco? Yeah, okay. Agricultural products? Yeah, that's great. Bananas, pineapples, tropical fruits, mangoes are going to go to Hawaii, from Hawaii to the West Coast. And so the war causes the United States to have to invest in a military conquest of the Philippines. So they build the infrastructure. So in an attempt for the Filipinos to get rid of the Americans, the problem is that the Americans dug in even deeper. Sort of the results. The U.S. occupies the Philippines. But the Philippines is never part of the U.S. the way Puerto Rico will become, the way Hawaii will become. It's in a way like Cuba. Now, Cuba will become independent. Cuba will very quickly get its own government. That's not because of this war what happens in the Philippines. The Philippines is a colony, except there's almost no colonization. Americans do not move to the Philippines. Unlike the French who moved to Vietnam, unlike Japanese who moved to Korea, unlike the British who moved to Hong Kong, there's almost none. It's 4,000 adults 40 years later. They nearly all live near Manila, and they're either government or army, government or navy. Sugar officers, the military, Protestant missionaries who are not very successful, because why become Protestant? You got Catholicism. And in the South, you have Islam. Like, why? So they show up and like, hey, we got Jesus. And like, we already got Jesus. Well, we got a better version of Jesus. Like, yeah. Why? And since the United States is not itself like relying on religion, like you can get a job working for the U.S. as, say, a teacher in a U.S. school without having to be Protestant. Remember our freedom of religion. So there's never a code in that. Should you give up your polytheism? Yes. So what we'll have is Catholicism will spread. In some places you get some Protestantism, but the polytheism tribes kind of disappear. But Filipino immigration to Hawaii, to California, is large, is big. Filipino workers, sailors, industrialists, because remember, there's no desire to industrialize the Philippines into making it a modern country. And so if you want to make money, you've got to work in a factory. Either you own a plantation or you work in the factory till you make enough money that you can become independent. Well, they're not going to build those factories in the Philippines, so you go to Hawaii, where you could work in the Navy, you could work in fishing, you could work in sailing, you work in some tourism, or you work on the sugar/pineapple plantations, or if you can really afford it, you go to California. That freaks the U.S. out. And in 1924, there's a wholesale stop of immigration, or an attempt to stop. Now, it's not just Filipino, it's Japanese, it's Italian, it's Jewish. There's a general freak out that America is becoming too much of a land of immigrants, or more importantly, the wrong kind of immigrants. And so in 1924, there's a stop. There's a hard kind of stop that will happen until 1960. 1964? I'm not enough of an American historian, but in the 60s, they'll reopen it up and we'll have our kind of modern quota system. In 1934, the Philippines gets independence. What the Filipino American War did was pause what was supposed to happen for 30 years. Notice the Philippines will run the Philippines, but the Americans will have a massive military presence. And basically, as long as the Philippines doesn't mess around with the naval bases, we're all cool. The U.S. will pay a fee for that because we're a rich country and we don't want any hard feelings. Is it the highest that the Philippines could probably ask? No, but it's better than what the British, the French, the Dutch are doing, which is nothing. It's all extraction. So if there's domestic problems, it's the Filipinos government's problem. You deal with it. Foreign relations, Japan, China, war in the Pacific, the future USSR, the USA will run it. And so in 1934, notice though, it's the middle of the Great Depression. FDR has just been elected in 1932. The U.S. is poor. The U.S. doesn't have the money to really run an empire. Now, the U.S. is still kind of rich, but it's the Great Depression. 25 to 30%. And in some industries, 45% of people are unemployed. And so you can't deal with an empire. You have to deal with domestic needs. And so it's like, all right, Philippines, just you run yourself. We don't want to run you too. So the Philippines gets its independence, has its own government. It's allied to the United States. The U.S. controls the foreign relations. But it also allows Filipinos to be able to access American markets, American goods. And so Filipinos will learn English, will get English language schooling. Those who are well off can go to Stanford, either University of Hawaii, or go to Stanford and various places in the West Coast. Some will even come to the East Coast following the trains. And you get a very tight economic relationship. You know, Filipinos are, remember, Americans are still racist, so Filipinos are still weird. But they're an acceptable East Asian country, as opposed to what will happen with Japan, China, in the next century, in the next couple of years, actually. And so we have that. All right, so that finishes our Philippines section. We go from of all the places, it's kind of the lightest touch of Europeans being there, because it's these weak empires, except for this one very harsh, very racist war, right? The Spanish-Filipino War is not nice either. But the Spanish troops, there's just less of them. There's less power. Spain is in 1894 just less powerful than the Americans. And the Americans do win in the Philippines, where they will not win in Vietnam. And one reason why is the Filipino groups didn't have outsiders to help. No one was going to support them versus the United States. No European group was going to support them, because if they won their independence, then what about their colonies? So, whereas Vietnam will have China, but especially the Soviet Union, always giving them money, always giving them supplies, keeping them in the fight, the way the French did for the United States, for the American colonies during the War for Independence. You have an outside patron who hates your enemy even more. That helps you to win independence. So we have Philippines. So we have Japan that's industrializing. So they're going to be the number one kind of winner in this period. They industrialize, they maintain their independence, they are never colonized. The Philippines does pretty well. I mean, there's the one terrible War of Independence, and then the war against the Americans. That's bad. But otherwise, the Philippines has a decent economy. They're jacked into the world trade through the largest economy in the world, into a larger labor system. It's of all the places, they are the least colonized and the most independent, other than, of course, Japan. So if you're the Filipinos, your life by 1939 is probably better than it was in 1800. You're more independent. You've got a country. You've got the Philippines as this kind of semi-autonomous country. You've got access to a large economic system. And so there's opportunities. That's not to say it's the greatest. It's the most free. But it's better than, say, being in East Timor. That's the idea. Okay, thank you. In our next episode, we're going to do some of Southeast Asia. Be safe. Take care.